Faffing, defined by the Urban Dictionary as to aimlessly waste time doing useless tasks. Example, stop faffing around and come to bed.
Hello and welcome back to Faffing with Friends. Today I'm joined by
Lawrence
and
Ivaylo.
And today we're talking about games and games as art or an art form. So guys, first of all, what makes a game a work of art? Does it have to be spectacular, have a good narrative ability to personalize the artistic experience? Or does it have to be memorable or wholly personal? And what do you guys say about that?
I mean, I think it's really based on each of us. I think we're all going to have a slightly altered definition of what we consider to be art in video games. For example, for me, it can be any of those elements because what constitutes art to me is simply something where after I have experienced it or played it or engaged with it, it sticks with me past the point where I turn it off. If something still lurks in my mind, if I still think about it, if I still consider things about it, a day after playing it, or even a week or a month or even more than that, I think that should classify, something as art.
I wholeheartedly agree with Lawrence, and I firmly believe that for me, I mean, we're all like students of the art here, and we're all very experienced with what it means to be someone who is in tune with the art business. So for me personally, I feel like a good game is always the same as like a good book. It's an experience where you sit down, you consume it, and you discuss it, you dissect it, and what you get from it, the message you get from it, the way it makes you feel, the emotions you feel is just, that for me is just what art really means. If it makes you feel, if it makes you think about it, as Lawrence said, if I go away from playing a game and I still talk about it a few years afterwards, then it's clearly left an impression on me, and it's clearly shapes my character. So for me, a video game that shapes up my character, sticks with me, inspires me to create, is simply art. There's no other way I can put it. It's simply art.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. It's an affective experience playing games. I've definitely had that experience from the first time I ever played, I don't know, Mario Brothers or whatever it was when I was 7. But somebody who doesn't agree with us at all is Roger Ebert.
Bring him on,
the
bring
famous
him on, yes,
film
yes,
critic.
bring him on.
So in 2005, he said about video games as an art form, quote, "To my knowledge, no one in or out of the field has ever been able to cite a game worthy of comparison with the great dramatists, poets, filmmakers, novelists, and composers. That a game can aspire to artistic importance as a visual experience, I accept. But for most gamers, video games represent a loss of those precious hours we have available to make ourselves more cultured, civilized, and empathetic," end quote. Okay, what do you guys say to that? I'm gonna hand it over to you guys.
I'm gonna give it to Lawrence because I know he has a few words to say to this man, so...
Go for it.
And I'm gonna play a bit of devil's advocate after Lawrence's point, so Lawrence, please go ahead and just do what you gotta do, bro.
Yeah, I'm gonna start. First off, I think when it comes to anything that isn't films, Roger Ebert was a moron. That's all I'm going to say about that. But also, he said this quote, I believe, in 2005. Now, by this point in time, we're not talking Tetris and Pac-Man anymore.
Oh, Lord.
We're talking things like Half-Life had released, Baldur's Gate had released, Shadow of the Colossus came out that very year. The fact he's still parroting crap like that, which he did most of his life about video games, just shows me that he's so stuck in his own medium of preference that he didn't really care to give another medium a chance. It can't possibly be on the same level because all it is to him is a waste of those precious hours where you can't really culture or civilize yourself. But the problem with that is a lot of my empathy and ability to feel the way I do for other people was grown through certain specific games because as a kid, I played more games than I did other things. I also read, I watched films, I watched shows, etc. But I played a lot of games when I was younger, and they shaped my character. I feel like I can more easily empathize with people because of games. Stuff like those old RPGs in the days, like Baldur's Gate, where it was all about making choices, moral choices, having this group of characters that were part of your party, they were your friends in those games. And every choice you made decided, how things would go, who would hate you, who would like you, how things would end. that made me think more about my choices than a film ever has, because I was actually making said choices. If anything, I argue that games are the ultimate art form for making someone more empathetic.
Hear, hear.
Because there's no other place where your action will impact the latter outcome. All you have to do is look at literally the entire lineage of RPGs as they've developed. From, as I said, early stuff like Baldur's Gate to Vampire the Masquerade to modern day RPGs like Divinity or Disco Elysium, where everything is affected by your choice. Mass Effect, all the BioWare stuff. Everything always went in the direction of increasing a person's empathy. The only way you can even play the fully evil pass in those games is if you literally feel nothing whatsoever. Because they ask you to make really difficult choices at times. Choices akin to like the genocide of entire species.
That's absolutely correct, and I absolutely agree with everything that you're saying. I do think, however, that Roger Ebert is a man stuck in his own time, as you mentioned. So I think we need to give him just a bit of a break, because another quote by him specifies something which I like to call the pattern phenomenon. So, for example, he says that one obvious difference between art and games is that you can win a game. It has rules, points, objectives, and an outcome. He also says that when a game changes and forgoes those things, it becomes a representation of a story, a novel, a play, dance, film, whatever have you. Those are things you cannot win, you can only experience them. So I think it's very important that you brought up stuff like the old games, like your Tetris and your Asteroids and your Pac-Mans and your Donkey Kongs, because those do have that sort of pattern phenomenon where you can win by memorizing a pattern and by trying to complete the game. It has a way more kind of like competitive sports kind of feeling to it. You go there to get the points, to survive, to win the game. Now, the games we currently have and the games we've been getting since he mentioned that quote in 2005 have kind of just like forgotten that idea, because in my personal opinion, video games have transcended and have become more close to being an experience rather than a game. Take for example the Uncharted games, We talk about the Uncharted games as being the first games to like embody like the spirit of cinema and, to recreate that whole Indiana Jones kind of feeling where you don't go to win the game, you go to experience the game. You go on a fantastical journey with Nathan Drake and you go to do all this kind of stuff where you're just hanging from trains and shooting on boats. So for me, I think not saying Ebert is correctly right, like he's very, very wrong. But again, he's a man who never got to see video games expand to the state that they are. He didn't get to see them become this medium of representation and this medium of art form. For him, they were just like a pattern where you just go and you have to like figure out the pattern and you have to win. But yeah, I pretty much agree with everything you're saying, to be honest. Like, he's a man out of time. I think he should have stuck to being a film critic, because I actually quite enjoy him as a film critic. But yeah, I completely agree with you on that, man. I completely agree with you, and I think that video games have pretty much transcended that, and we're currently at a very different stage in video game development where we can safely say that they are indeed an art form.
Yeah, and I mean, literally my biggest problem with his take was always, if you ask someone who doesn't like cinema, is cinema an art form?
Yeah,
they're going to say no.
Absolutely.
It's the exact same thing, but from his side. Like,
absolutely.
Of course he didn't think games were art, because he hated them. He didn't like video games.
Yeah.
Like I said, those quotes are so recent that things we consider, like, to be preserved art pieces for history, like Shadow of the Colossus, came out that year.
Absolutely.
Even if stuff happened in his lifetime, I don't think he ever would have given it a chance.
Yeah, and one of his biggest critiques is Kelly Santiago, and she said herself that by the time Ebert said that quote, video games, and I still kind of believe this, I still kind of believe that video games as like an artistic media are still kind of in their, like, infant stage. Like, they're still kind of developing, Who knows what we'll have in, like, 20, 30
But see,
years' time.
I think that makes just how much they've achieved that much more incredible.
Exactly what I mean. But yeah, Joe, we've talked about our passion for Roger Ebert, and I'm very thankful you brought up that quote, but go on, you bring us some hot art takes. Go on.
Well, it's not particularly hot. It's just, I think, common sense. You could always multitask. You can listen to a podcast whilst you game, or you can listen to music, or maybe even an audiobook.
Breaking the
There's nothing
fourth wall
stopping you. Exactly, yeah. There's nothing stopping you from being cultured. You're not losing any hours. You're gaining.
Well, I mean, the thing is, the point you're also making is kind of, I disagree with it, because if a game is art, you don't want to listen to something else
and you
doing
have to
it.
experience it, in my opinion.
Like, yeah.
Oh, for sure. But even then, let's say you're playing a game that's a work of art, right? It's not like you're going to take 8 hours of your day just playing that. And even if you do, that doesn't mean you can't set aside any time for any other hobbies. And that's what it is, gaming. Gaming is a hobby. And it's a pretty okay hobby, so long as, you don't take it to the extremes.
And I mean, again, what's the difference between, say, playing a game that takes 8 hours or binging a television series that takes 64 hours?
Yeah, exactly.
The participation, Lawrence, the participation.
But you know what I mean? There's no like extra time wasted as opposed to any of the other art forms. There are books that are like 1,000 pages long that I could spend weeks reading.
Like War and Peace. Well, no, you both make good points. For example, if you take, I don't know, books, movies, music, paintings, or whatever, it will take a long time to consume any of those media forms. But it's the same for games, right? But it doesn't take anything away from you if you're just taking some time away from all the other media forms and dedicating it to games. In my opinion, we should be doing that more. Just like you said, it does make you more empathetic. You do learn something from it. You do learn, especially if you're playing RPG games, you do learn the consequences of your actions, and that could be effective. Some people make silly arguments like games can make you violent, but I think that's baseless because
that's also been disproven by scientific studies for like 20 years now. It's literally just
I do want to bring that to the fore because I did see that like the biggest complaints that we've seen about video games is that they can induce violence, and that for me is one of the most garbage takes that I've seen. Every single person who I know plays video games are like the least violent and the least impulsive people I know. For me personally, I genuinely feel that like people who like say that are just looking for excuses when real life tragedy happens,
It's like, I love Tarantino, right? Like, he's one of my favorite filmmakers, but he makes some of the most violent shit you have ever seen on, like, film.
Exactly.
You go watch the ending of Django again, and it's just, if that doesn't turn me into a murdering psychopath, then guess what? Nothing is.
Absolutely. And I feel like video games have been put as like this kind of little like sacrificial lamb thing when a tragedy happens. I mean, not to bring back tragedy, but like for example, Columbine. When Columbine happened, Doom was at the forefront of being the video game that inspired the shooters. Marilyn Manson got all the blame for that.
Yeah, exactly. That brings something else up. Before games, the scapegoat was music.
Exactly, yeah.
There's always been like an art form that's been deeply disrespected or used as a scapegoat. That doesn't change anything about the actual reality of said art form. That's just people require scapegoats, so they go for whatever's newest or craziest to them.
So that they ignore taking responsibility. Yeah.
But bringing it back to what Ivaylo also said about participation, I definitely believe it's about personalizing the artistic expression, whilst also maintaining the authority of the artist. Because whatever game you're playing, it's obviously been written and designed by whoever made it to be exactly the way you're playing it, but for the input that you put in. So if you have games where you have multiple choice, answers, things to do, quests or whatever, ways you can go about completing the game, and each time it can have different results, that could be very fun and entertaining, and I think that adds to it as an art form. Whereas if you go and look at a painting or watch a movie or a TV show or read a book, there's only so much you can do. I mean, maybe you write fan fiction as a reaction to a book you read, but then again, that's not exactly the same thing as playing a game. So I'm going to ask if you guys have anything else to say about that before we start talking about games that we consider works of art. Do you guys want to add anything?
I do want to touch on Ebert's ideas one last time. It'll actually lead into the first game I want to talk about personally.
Go for it.
Another thing he believed was that because in some games you can alter the ending or the way a game will play out through your choices, it affects the artistic expression of a work and its integrity because, supposedly, because it doesn't end a specific way, there's no authorial intent or whatever. Yeah. But I think that's a ridiculous ridiculous idea, because the first game I want to talk about that I consider one of the greatest pieces of art I have ever experienced is Disco Elysium. Now, Disco Elysium is a very recent RPG, at least by the time we're recording this, that does something I've wanted from an RPG and had not seen to this degree in like decades. So in the past, RPGs were a lot more focused on giving you a lot of choice because everything being small budget, it meant there wasn't voice acting, etc. There wasn't a lot of the stuff that adds constraints. So you could just have text, a lot of text that gave you flavor and lore and expanded characters and universe and made your choices actually matter to a ridiculous degree. Now, Disco Elysium has about a few 100,000 pages of writing in it, I believe, just from what I've seen in it. And the entire concept of Disco Elysium as an RPG is almost like reading a book, except you have full control of choices and outcomes. And there's also the D&D element where if you have a high enough skill in certain areas, things will roll and you'll get a check that lets you do something or lets you not. But Disco Elysium having choice to the degree that it has, further than I've probably ever seen in a game with choice, I think adds so much to the artistic impact of it. Your character is someone who experiences the worst existential depression I've ever seen. And I think we've all dealt with depression at some point or another, us three, because we've talked about that together. But I've never seen a more accurate display of what that horrible sensation, that dread, that nihilism feels like than how this game portrays it. There is, in multiple points in this game, you're a detective, right? You're a cop in this weird, semi-authoritarian future dystopia city. But multiple times in the game, your character will express his discontent and depression. It's consistent. It's in him constantly. You see it through him. But also through the choices you're given. You are allowed to do things that I have never seen a video game have the gall to let you do at moments. So because you're a detective, you carry a gun, right? Now, you're not supposed to use it, and your partner in the game expressly tells you, it's best if you never use the gun. Those situations are bad. There are moments in the game where the game will let you kill yourself using your handgun if you somehow feel that your character truly feels that way. And they are treated with such a level of severity and seriousness. And the fact that the game lets you go through with that shows me such a level of respect for this concept, this issue, this topic. So many games will give you a character that supposedly feels certain things, but then throughout the actual gameplay are never allowed to actually make choices that express that. So it creates this cognitive dissonance between the gameplay and the narrative. But in this game, your character, if you see him as so depressed, so done, so nihilistic, that he would be willing to just end his life, you can make him do that. You can make him shoot people at random. You can have him be a drunk the entire game that never achieves a single thing. And there is enough writing done that this entire path is possible. Every single path I could imagine for that game was possible. I've played it maybe a dozen times now just to keep seeing what having different characteristics leads to, just to see what other choices exist, what failing choices gets you. This is one of the few games where when you fail something, a skill check, a choice, the game continues. You failed that thing. If you fucked something up where you're going to, solve crimes or something because you're a detective, that crime remains unsolved. You've lost that piece of evidence. The game goes on. It is the most incredible thing I've seen in an RPG with this much detail and this well written. Just everything. The way choices affect what you do, the way the story branches off, how failure and success don't determine an endpoint at times. They simply determine how this will continue. You can fail things early on, and the game will still go on for its whole run, for hours and hours. And you can be wrong and consistently chase the wrong lead and make the wrong choices. And it is so incredible to see that in a game. I didn't expect to see it, frankly, especially with how a lot of AAA games, because of stuff like voice acting, would never have the budget to do something like that. But this indie game is, to me, a pinnacle point of, like, the interweaving of writing, narrative, and video games. And it just blows my mind.
Fantastic. That was an absolutely amazing description. Like, hell yeah, I absolutely agree with everything you say about discoelysium. I'm very happy that you brought the idea of choice. It's been a constant theme since the start of the podcast, and this idea of having to choose the narrative and determining where the narrative goes. And again, this is where I absolutely hate Ebert for saying that. I think that having the ability to choose your own path in video games it's a pinnacle, it's a cornerstone of art in video games. I feel like a lot of it, I'm a big fan of the early Telltale games because they kind of recreate the same idea of, bringing a book back to life, or in this case a graphic narrative back to life. Two of their most successful games that they have successfully adapted have been The Walking Dead by Robert Kirkman and Fables by Bill Whittingham. They have both created two significantly powerful masterpieces. They've also done Batman, they've also done Game of Thrones, but that they were like in their twilight-ish years. And again, I feel like having that option to... I'm not saying that every single game that gives you a choice to like choose your own destiny is art. I'm not saying that. But
no, because there's some that do a very hollow job.
It's a very hollow
but
job.
The ones that get it right, it's something.
Exactly. And I feel like Telltale does get that right as well. And I feel that like by putting the weight of the character's choices on the player's shoulders, it's a very powerful way of making the person feel and empathize with characters, empathize with their actions. In The Walking Dead, there's a very powerful moment where, I mean, you surely know this, when you are forced to choose if you can kill your kid's friend or not after he's already been bitten. And do you just let him turn into a zombie in the forest, or do you kill him and you just spare him all the trouble? Powerful ambient choices like that. It's just, I do miss Telltale at their prime. But yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I think that having the ability to choose does not diminish a video game at all. It just kind of increases the stakes and just kind of adds to the artistic value. Because again, Ebert's point was that, for example, you can choose, if you are able to choose the ending of like Romeo and Juliet, that will kind of devalue the play. Like, oh, for example, Romeo does not kill himself and Juliet does not kill herself, and it's a different ending, and that diminishes the value of the product.
And I mean that brings me back to like in Disco Elysium, where I got my character to kill himself.
Oh wow! At
a point, giving you the choice to end something well or good, or as opposed to bad endings, that doesn't mean every player will make that choice.
Yeah, exactly.
The fact that you're allowed, like, the only reason I went through it in Disco Elysium was I really wanted to see if the game actually allowed for that. If the parameters were, grand enough that if I continued pressing that option, it would actually happen.
Exactly.
And once it did, I was so shocked and so shook that a game allowed me to do it in that way. So, like, real. It felt so raw and visceral that I had to like pretty much continuously go for those kinds of options until my character actually did it. That I stopped playing for a good like half an hour and just sat there at my computer looking at the game like, I can't believe a game allowed me this choice. I can't believe it didn't force me or railroad me into an ending that the author thought was fitting.
Yeah, some good stuff.
Yeah. I think both Disco Elysium and the Telltale games that you guys mentioned, they're very good examples of games of art. I was especially very fond of the Game of Thrones Telltale.
Were you? I didn't actually enjoy that. I'm so sorry. I didn't actually enjoy that.
Yeah, same.
I didn't actually ever play that. I only watched walkthroughs, but I was quite invested in the Forrester storyline. The Northern family. I wanted to see how that goes, but we all know what happened to Telltale. But what you both mentioned reminded me of was you choose your own adventure books, which was the fad back in the 80s, where you could pick up a book, and depending on how you wanted the book to end, you could like decide, okay, you wanted it to go one way, or you wanted to choose the genre, and then you'd flip to a certain page that would tell you to go to, and then you would continue from there. So what we have now is pretty much the same concept, but in game form. And exactly as you guys have said, these are examples of games that are actually pretty artistic in how they do that. So I think I'm not sure if you guys will agree with this, but I'll promise that this will be the only time that I'll mention it in this podcast. But for me, Skyrim has that effect. When I first started playing Skyrim, and I'm going to put it out there, I'm not a huge gamer. I've never actually been a big gamer, although I generally just do enjoy playing games. But when I first started playing Skyrim, I was amazed by the options that you had, how you could decide to do things a certain way, especially the whole, for me, this is back in 2011, right? So the whole, do you want to side with the Stormcloaks or the Imperials? That for me, was always a decision between, it was always tough, especially when before I had mods installed, you had to play through the vanilla opening, which was you go to Helgen, and you had to decide which soldier you wanted to go with. And even though at that time it didn't really have an impact on which side you ultimately chose to go with, but for me it was always, do I go with the Stormcloaks or the other guy, the Imperial? Can't remember the character names, but it was always a big choice for me. It's like, I really want to make sure I get it right this time. But obviously, the first time I go with the Imperials, and the second time I go with the Stormcloaks. And then throughout the whole game, you have multiple choices, where if you do a quest, you can always kill someone or spare their lives, or you could do things in a certain way that, keeps, deaths to a minimum. If you want to have a moral playthrough, which again, it's quite difficult to do that with a game like Skyrim. I always find myself doing things that in the real world I would find morally repugnant if I did or anyone else did. But another argument I want to make is that games in general, especially ones that are either spectacular, like Ghost of Tsushima, which I've recently been watching walkthroughs on, or more importantly, I think games that I hope I don't lose my train of thought here. But games that just allow you to experience things that are cathartic, and games themselves are cathartic, I think. Things that you could do in games like both Lawrence and Ivaylo have said that you can't really do in books or whilst you're watching a movie or even in real life. I think that also, the experience that it gives you, the impact that the neural links that you make from playing games, it's just not the same. It could never compare to watching a movie for me. So that's my last take on Ebert. And since I've also mentioned the game, I think I'll ask you guys any other games that you have in mind that come close or, are define as a game of art or work of art.
I mean, you mentioned two things I actually do want to talk about. First off, Skyrim, I don't agree with you that it's a good game, at least pre-mod.
Oh.
Vanilla Skyrim to me is a great canvas for people to turn into actual art.
For sure.
But the game itself is deeply shallow, and the choices compared to the earlier Bethesda games are just less and less impactful.
Some trouble in paradise on Faffing with Friends, boys.
I mean, there's no trouble. He knows that that's the case because I've showed him the earlier Bethesda games now and then. So,
yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true.
And the one I think is probably the best ever come was developed by a studio that wasn't even Bethesda with their IP, and that's Fallout New Vegas. And whereas Skyrim and a lot of Bethesda's later stuff like Fallout 4 has a big issue of the morality is almost like a bludgeoning hammer of how simple and silly it is. There's really just good and bad in more modern Bethesda games. In something like New Vegas, you're put in a world where you have 4 different factions and multiple sub-factions that all have their own morality system and that all have their own outlook of your character as you play the RPG and make the choices and decide how to handle different factions. So you can be vilified by one faction and idolized by another, and it has nothing to do with like easy to figure out bludgeoning over your head morality. It's not, am I a mass murdering psychopath? Oh, everyone dislikes me. Am I a so-and-so? Everyone likes me. It's, what did I do to this faction and why do they not like me? What did I do to this faction that I haven't even met where just the reputation I've accrued makes them want to work with me? That I think is the deepest a Bethesda game has ever reached, to that point where you almost feel like morality works like it does in the real world. You don't have good and bad. You have grays, moral grays. There is, faction that is literally just a post-apocalyptic reimagining of the Roman Empire. And that comes with all the caveats of Roman Empire using slavery, selling people, crucifying people that they deemed degenerates or barbarians. And the thing is, if you go far enough on their side and follow their quest line, yes, you still disagree with them if you have, modern morals, but you get to a point where the leader of that faction will have a sit-down face-to-face with you and explain to you precisely what he believes, why he believes it, and why this faction is the best for the wasteland, for like the post-apocalyptic world and rebuilding it. And you get that in Fallout New Vegas in spades. Every single side quest, every single main quest is so much deeper than what a lot of modern Bethesda stuff like Skyrim will give you. Like in Skyrim, for example, there's a point that I hate, it's my least favorite thing in the entire game, where the Blades, one of the factions, will ask you to kill Parthenax, this great elder dragon that's been your ally in the entire game. And the choice is kill Parthenax or don't progress the Blade storyline. Now, there's a mod that fixes this and gives you a third option.
That's right.
But something like New Vegas would have given you 7 different options off the go. It would have given you those choices without you having to be like, wait a minute, why is this such a dead end? Are these people really so black and white that I can't possibly convince them that this is a stupid idea? And that's where I think a lot of like shallower choice-based games like Skyrim fail in being what they could have been. So I think it's more of a canvas where people have modded in such a degree of quality content and additions to the already existing systems that it almost does become art.
Yeah, I agree with that. Once Lawrence told me that there was a mod that could fix the Parthenax paradox. I think that's when I actually truly started to enjoy Skyrim, because I played Skyrim maybe twice before that and completed it. And then that was it. And for a long time, I didn't touch it. In fact, funnily enough, last time I played Skyrim before I started modding it again in 2020 was in 2016. And it was right around the time of the referendum. And I was like, I wonder which side I should go with. And that was a very interesting playthrough for me. But
I mean, even the name of that quest is a mockery. The Parthenax paradox. It's only a paradox because you're forced into a fake paradox.
Yeah, exactly. Which is, I think, in fact, the first time I played it, I stopped playing the game because I didn't want to kill Parthenax. Like, I know it's just this made-up binary code of a character, but it wasn't to me, and it wasn't to you either, or I'm assuming to a lot of people who played it, especially those who made the mod, right? Because you create this relationship with Parthenax. He's like this sort of mentor figure, and he's a good dragon. Like, he's on the good side of, because the dragons are supposed to be these evil characters, especially Alduin anyway. So what do? You don't want to kill someone like that. So yeah, definitely agree with you. Mods do give value to a game like Skyrim.
And I mean, this adds something that we don't even see in most games, which I think makes them even more of a compelling art form. And that's some games, you will have such passionate people who love these art forms so deeply that they will go and physically write more code. They will add alterations to make something where there are failings better. There are people who will go out of their way to fix issues like this in certain games, and no other medium will allow you, if you're passionate enough, to go take something that's done wrong or done to a subpar quality level and improve upon it out of nothing but your own will to do so.
I very much agree on that.
You don't get mods to anything else.
I think that's another beauty of the video games. The experience for all the senses, It gives you complete and total control to edit and to create your own versions. As you mentioned, mods are exactly that. Mods are rewritings and creations of your own choice. And that is absolutely beautiful to me. Again, as you mentioned, the community is so huge that all these people are getting together, taking their precious time and, just expanding their own hobbies, man. And in that way, expanding the hobbies of everyone else. Now,
I mean, this makes me want to ask you something, Ivaylo, and it'll bring us to a game I know you want to talk about. How do you feel about the almost 2 decades now that have been spent hunting for secrets in Shadow of the Colossus?
I mean, I wasn't going to really talk about Shadow just yet, but I'm going to pair it up with another game which kind of has the same nature as Shadow.
Mm-hmm.
And these two games create for me what I like to call the mocking paradox, because they kind of mock you in a way. So basically what I'm trying to say is that you have Shadow of the Colossus and you have Bioshock, two games who really make you feel completely worthless as a player. And not in a bad way, but in the way that you as a player have all the control within the video game, while simultaneously you have zero control over the events of the game whatsoever. It's quite a it's quite a paradox. So as you mentioned again, Shadow of the Colossus. I absolutely love Shadow of the Colossus. I think it is perhaps the greatest game of all time ever made. We can debate that later, but Shadow of the Colossus is a very simple slay the dragon, rescue the princess kind of story. You know, you're a boy called Wanda. You're on his horse called Agro, and you go in to rescue your dead sister / girlfriend, whatever it is. It's completely ambiguous. You go to these forbidden lands and you are tasked with the quest of slaying 16 mythical beasts. Absolutely gorgeous colossi. Like, they're absolutely gorgeous. They each have their own characteristics. They each have their own personalities. Some attack you on sight. Others don't attack you at all. And throughout the game, as you continue to go on this quest for righteousness and for fulfilling your own personal needs, you kill these beasts. You kill them, and it's a grandiose death. They fall, the soundtrack goes blaring at you that you've killed something that you really shouldn't have killed. Black tendrils pop up from the corpse of these creatures, and they embed themselves into your character. And as the game progresses, you slowly see your character become a bit more corrupt. The skin changes, his eyes change, his whole movements, his clothes become tattered and wasted. And when you complete Shadow of the Colossus, spoilers for anyone by the way, it's a 20-year-old game, go play it. Spoilers, at the end of the day, you realize that you never had the right. You never had the right to go and desecrate these sacred beasts for your own gain. The only way you could have actually won the game is if you actually just don't play the game at all. Like, when you felt that you were desecrating the game for example, by like the 14th, 15th Colossi, you realize that, oh shit, I'm transgressing on something that should not be touched by anyone. They're forbidden lands for a reason. And the game concludes with Wanda transforming into a monster. He fulfills his goal of resurrecting Mono, but the price is something that is still debated to this day. Was all that worth it? Was desecrating all that sacredcy and all that magic worth it for that one quest? And the game never really gives you a solid answer. It just tells you to go and to kill 16 magical creatures, which you go and do because that's the game. You win the game by killing these 16 magical creatures, and afterwards you feel completely powerless because had you known, you would have prevented it. And I don't know if that's the case.
Can I also add something for Shadow specifically?
Go on.
I think another thing that is really impactful and really specific to that game, I don't think I've felt it or seen it anywhere else. This land that you're in is really grand, right? It's grandiose to the point where you feel small.
It's humongous.
But as you wipe out these colossi, it feels emptier and emptier.
And it gets smaller and smaller because every single colossus you kill leaves a beam of light up into the sky. So you can know where the corpses are. So by the 16th colossus, you have like these 15 giant beams into the sky. And the land just feels wasted. It feels sick.
Yeah, exactly.
Just like you.
It's one of the few games where you can feel the damage you're doing through the game world as you progress.
Absolutely.
The emptier and lonelier you feel in that game, the more you've progressed because you are killing everything in that land. You're taking like all the life and good out of it.
Exactly. And again, it's a great experience because, you know, sometimes I've used Shadow of the Colossus many times to cope with mental health issues, just like you've mentioned with Disco Elysium. We're no strangers to, especially in lockdown, with the feelings we get sometimes. And Shadow of the Colossus, I really sometimes view the Colossi as just these things which you have to defeat. Like, you don't take joy in defeating them, but you have to defeat them. You know, you go on this journey, this by yourself, and you go through them, and you defeat them, and sometimes it's worth it, you know? Sometimes the cost is worth it. But this was actually used, I believe it was used in one of the films with Adam Sandler and I believe Morgan Freeman. They were like, I don't know what the film was called, but it was a film from the early 2000s where the Colossi falling down symbolized the World Trade Center collapsing on 9/11, which was...
It's so weird. I remember
Yeah,
the scene
you know what I'm talking about, right? You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
It's absolutely insane how Shadow is like had this constant impact almost as a factor for trauma. Like, you go there to experience your trauma and to cleanse yourself. And again, this ties in beautifully with Joe's point about video games being cathartic. I've never felt more catharsis, yet I've also never felt more emptier than when I've defeated Shadow of the Colossus. Like, it's a very weird feeling. And again, it's a game that accommodates how you feel, but it's also a game that significantly mocks you. Like, you go into that game...
I mean, you use the word defeated it, and I think both it and Bioshock by the end kind of break you. Like, their entire purpose is to beat you.
I'm gonna jump into Bioshock now that you've mentioned it, and what better way to start talking about Bioshock than to read to you and to all our dear listeners the opening speech of the game's main antagonist, Andrew Ryan. So, if I may begin. I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow? No, says the man in Washington. It belongs to the poor. No, says the man in the Vatican. It belongs to God. No, says the man in Moscow. It belongs to everyone. I rejected those answers. Instead, I chose something different. I chose the impossible. I chose Rapture. A city where the artist would not fear the censor, where the scientist would not be bound by petty morality, where the great would not be constrained by the small, and with the sweat of your brow, Rapture can become your city as well. Now, the first thing that struck me about that speech, notice how Ryan never says you get to keep the sweat of your brow. It is never that. It is never that. And for anyone who hasn't played Bioshock out there, one of the greatest games of all time, please go ahead and play it. First-person shooter where you are in a underwater city called Rapture. It is completely gorgeous and amazing, but it is also completely rotten and it's collapsing, and you discover it towards the end of a huge civil war. So, Andrew Ryan is obviously an anagram of Ayn Rand. Her philosophy on objectivism and
Yuck.
her idea... Yuck, exactly. Her whole idea drives Bioshock, but it also makes fun of Bioshock because it presents a world where that idea is just left to completely like rampage.
Yeah, it shows you her ideology at its absolute extremist if it was allowed to do its thing.
And you're put in the shoes of this protagonist called Jack. You know nothing about him. He's meant to be a foil for you. And you go and you explore Rapture. You get to see all these people fighting over this substance called Adam, which gives you super strength and it enhances your abilities. The whole society has been shaped up by it. And because of it, the Civil War has broken out. Now, the thing about Adam is something similar to what you guys mentioned in Dune with the spice. You need to keep consuming more and more of it in order to be okay, in order to live. And that just brings the whole of Rapture completely just to the floor, man. It just completely tears it to shreds. But to return to the choice of the question, again, just like in Shadow of the Colossus, you go and you complete this game. You're guided by a figure called Atlas, again, taken from Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. You are taken and you go on this mission to get to Andrew Ryan and to take him down. Once you get there, you realize that as a gamer, as a human being, you have not had any choice over the events of the game. Because all this time, again, spoilers, 20-year-old game, people, go play it. Again, you have been guided by Atlas's catchphrase, which has been said throughout the game many times, and you are nothing but a slave. You are nothing but a slave guided there, genetically engineered to survive Rapture. and to take down Andrew Ryan. You as a player at that point feel completely and utterly hopeless because you can't even take control. In the scene where you kill Andrew Ryan, you kill him with a golf club, I found myself stressfully pressing the buttons on the controller to try and stop him, but I could not because he had uttered the words, "Would you kindly," which are a trigger phase for the protagonist. And that to me is absolute beauty. That for me is art right there. Because as much as video games,
the way Andrew Ryan like literally mocks you by not giving you the catharsis of killing him, who seemed to be the main villain of the game, and then him making you kill him out of your own control.
Absolutely, and that's the thing. He just gives you one final kick in the balls because he says, "A man chooses and a slave obeys." And you see that and you want to stop it, but your character simply cannot stop it because he is that. He's just a slave. And again, we talked about how much video games are improved by the mechanic of the choice, how they make you more empathetic, how they make you more emotional. But for me, games like Shadow of the Colossus and games like Bioshock, where the developers, both Fumito Ueda and Ken Levine, take that idea, twist it around, and just smack you over the head and say, yes, you have the choice of playing this game, but you have no control over what happens in it. And to be fair, I firmly agree that if Roger Ebert had played both of those games, he would be quite pleased with himself because, again, you cannot really alter the ending that much. Now, I'm not saying Bioshock is a completely choiceless game.
I think the very existence of those games and the message they try to impart on you literally cannot exist without the pre-existing culture of games.
Exactly, absolutely.
Like the fact that there were games where your choice does to some degree matter, and then these games critique, you know, a narrative where you are completely railroaded and almost mock you for having no choice.
Yes.
That can't exist in a vacuum.
Exactly.
The existence of these two incredible pieces of art is reliant on the art before it.
Everything is reliant on the art before it. But it's just like, I think that what Ebert was going on is that he was talking about, again, I mentioned, he was talking about the simple platformers. The games like Pac-Man where you put a quarter to play, you know. Those games, yeah, they have a purpose, but their end game is to like rack up the high score. You know, that's the point of Pac-Man, you know. You finish the level, you rack up the high score. But in these mediums where you have ideas of philosophy, ideas of internalized struggle, ideas of freedom as your own player, like you yourself experience it. Because Andrew Ryan is not talking to Jack, Andrew Ryan is talking to you. He is looking you dead in the eye and he's telling you, you can't do nothing because you're behind the screen. The only way you can not kill me is if you press the button on your console, take a disc out, put it on your box, and leave it on the shelf. That's how you defeat Andrew Ryan. That's how you become a man. But it just goes, it's such a hilarious thing to me. Like, it's absolutely hilarious. Like, oh boy. I love Bioshock, man. I can talk about Bioshock
and I mean,
for ages.
Can I add something that you've actually led to? So far we sound like fart-sniffing morons up our own ass in one sense. And
absolutely.
That is, every example we've given is one of, like, deep philosophical thought and almost narrative and literature all applied onto games. But I think there is a form of art in games, too, that is completely relevant to like gameplay and the catharsis of gameplay. And the
music and everything else that goes into it.
And yes, for that I want to use certain specific games as an example. Hit me. When you look at stuff like games made by Platinum, like Metal Gear Rising, or when you look at the DMC series, these are games that rely on the gameplay itself being your artistic expression. You are given a tool set that is almost like incredibly too large for you to use at first. You have to learn movesets that are like 30 to 100 in some games, moves large, and then mix them up however you want. And every single enemy you fight and meet in those games and the way you tackle them, that is your artistic expression.
I'm glad you mentioned DMC. DMC has a bloody ranking system, bro. You get grades for the gameplay, which is a fucking amazing quality. Like, again.
And DMC does something else incredible, and that's as you get better at the game, other components of the game start egging you on. The music gets more hardcore. It gets going better.
Yeah.
It reaches parts where there's lyricism. In Metal Gear Rising, every time you get to the final phase of a boss, they all have their own specific themes. And only when you reach that point does their vocal track kick in. And you get this incredible mix of just different elements creating this sensation you can never get from different art forms, because you are doing this yourself, taking part in this incredibly testing gameplay, where at times it's incredibly difficult depending on how you play these games, and it takes a lot out of you. But because you're doing it well and you're feeling it and you're almost getting into this groove, I think that is its own sort of art. I think video games have that power to not just be art in the narrative sense.
You don't have to
what
be
can they make you
philosophical and
think
deep all the time to be a good
exactly.
To be a piece of art.
They can be art in like the new Doom games. I know you don't like them, but they give you such a sense of speed and never-ending movement and just momentum and just crushing through hundreds of enemies with like ridiculous amount of things you have to keep track of at the same time, that I feel that is an incredible thing that no other art form has ever made me feel.
Absolutely, bro. Absolutely. I completely agree. And a game that does that, a game that mixes both incredible gameplay, music, graphics, and incredibly deep philosophical themes of nihilism, existentialism. Nier Automata, that's a game which does it all, in my opinion. It's a jack-of-all-trades game where it can be...
And I mean, the best part about that is it's developed the gameplay part by Platinum.
Exactly my point. And you have these, again, you have the whole kind of snobby kind of, the philosophy of nihilism and what's real and what's not, what does it mean to live, while also you feel like a complete badass while hacking and slashing your way through it. Like, it's absolutely amazing. I absolutely love when that medium is combined, where you have beautiful, gorgeous gameplay, which makes you feel like you're doing stuff, and incredible narrative, philosophical discussions. And I think that's the future, and I think we're seeing more and more of it with Ghost of Tsushima, God of War, all these kind of other games, which...
Yeah, that just makes me want to talk about, like, more of, like, games we haven't mentioned and maybe genres we haven't touched upon, and, like... One series I would recommend to anyone who wants to see games as an art form is the Soulsborne series in its entirety, like the ones made by FromSoft, the guys who actually made Dark Souls. From Dark Souls 1 to 3, and then Bloodborne, and even Sekiro, those games are such incredible pieces of video games as art. I talked on one episode, I think, of Fantasy Worlds, where we discussed them. I mentioned how, like, you get dropped in these worlds with absolutely no extra information and no guiding hand. So you have to piece together a narrative and a lore and, like, almost entire mythologies and figure out literally the entire world you're in through everything you find in the world. Both cues in the environment, the enemies you fight, the way they look, how they act, the descriptions of items and weapons. There's so much in that. No other medium asks that of you, where you have to go and make the effort to get the most out of this art form. You don't just sit back and have narrative and exposition fed to you. You have to actively dig and go out of your way to even find out if there's backstory to certain characters and certain events and certain enemies. And that, to me, is, again, another thing that just... What other medium can even claim to do something like that?
Exactly, man. It's very rare.
I'm glad you mentioned Dark Souls. It's one of the games that I really enjoyed playing a long time ago. I've since enjoyed watching it being played, because my PC unfortunately can't run the newer versions, especially the remastered ones. What I'm going to do is mention a few honorables before I pass it back to you guys.
Of course.
So... For me, both because of the modding aspects and also the fact that I played these games when I was going through some difficult times. So I wanted to mention Stronghold, Crusader Kings 2, which I'll get to in a minute, Total War series. The Godfather is my hot take.
Really?
I'll get to that.
The Godfather video game.
And also, the early, not the entire series, but the early few Harry Potter games.
Oh my gosh.
I really enjoyed playing a lot.
You've actually unlocked repressed memories with that.
Yes.
My gosh.
And also Assassin's Creed and, Mario Kart games. But the other ones I wanted to mention, the honorable mentions are, which I won't get to talk to about, Legacy of Kain, the Lego Hobbit, Shinobi, which was a very early PlayStation game, not even PlayStation 2, it was a PlayStation 1 game. And I really enjoyed it. This was back in maybe 2000, 2001 when I played it. So you start off as this Shinobi, you have to go around assassinating people, right? And you level up to a ninja throughout the game, and it's just the intricate ways that you can go completing the mission. Like, obviously, a 7-year-old child should not be playing this game like I was. Don't tell my parents. But it was so fun that, you had even a game as early as that, you had multiple ways of getting to your target. You didn't have multiple ways of, doing other things, but you could...
I think the ultimate iteration of that in modern games is Hitman, where you're given
absolutely
incredibly intricate levels and sandboxes, and you're just told, achieve this objective and do it however you please.
That's right. I was watching a game walkthrough of that this morning of Hitman 3, the new release. Other mentions, Breath of the Wild. I know that's one of my brother's favorite games. He plays it on his Switch, and obviously Animal
I wish to play Breath of the Wild so badly. It's so good.
He thinks it's one of the best games. He argues with me that Skyrim is trash compared to Breath of the Wild, and he's probably right. So Call of Duty 3 was one of my favorite games in this entire series. Obviously, I like a lot of the modern versions of the game. I think Call of Duty Cold War was really well done. A Wolfenstein as well, we mentioned that earlier, or might have done off mic. But now I want to get to the ones that I do want to talk about really quickly before I pass it back to you guys. I know we're not short for time really, but Stronghold. For me, Stronghold is one of those games where basically all you're doing is balancing numbers on a spreadsheet, on like an Excel spreadsheet. So all you're doing really is you're is it still called mana or whatever? Your resources. You're building up resources to go to battle or to defend against a siege or whatever it is. But I always found that fun. I used to play that for a long time when I was, a young teenager. And then again, in my early 20s. I haven't really played it much recently, even though I now have the complete collection. I got a £5 bundle on Steam recently, which I was debating getting. And then Lawrence was like, you're an idiot, get it, that's a bargain. And I was like, yeah, you're probably right. But also Crusader Kings 2. Okay, so Crusader Kings 2 and Stronghold and the Total War series, especially the earlier versions, especially Medieval Total War, which I used to mod before I even knew a modding community existed. Crusader Kings 2 got me through the most difficult times. It might sound weird, but it's basically you start off as a count or a duke or a king, or with the new Rise to Power mod, which almost killed my PC twice this week because of how it's programmed.
We almost didn't record this episode because of that.
I know, right? I'm sorry to the developer. I know you've put in a lot of hard work, but my goodness, it's so many flaws. But anyway, you can even be a baron now. So this game, you can start off as anyone in a world that you want to back in 1066 or any other bookmark that you can choose on their list. And the ultimate aim of the game is whatever you want it to be. If you want to become an emperor, you can work your way up through that. If you want to just, become a merchant republic and oust all of your rivals so that you're the only merchant republic in existence.
If all you want to do is become a bringer of incest and create the Habsburg line, you can do that too.
Yeah. Absolutely you can. God. There are mechanics where you can form a new religion where part of it is something called divine marriage or something, where if you marry your family members, then you have fewer congenital issues that generally come with that sort of arrangement. So it's a really fun game. It has a lot of open-ended ways of playing it, and then there are ways you can convert it sort of starts off in the 800 or 700 or something like that. You can even start off as a Viking going on conquest, and it ends in 1453, I think, when Constantinople historically falls to the Ottomans. And you can convert the game onto Europa Universalis 4, and then continue the game from that onwards. And then you can even convert it to Victoria 2, and then finally to...
and then HO4.
Exactly, yeah, that's right, exactly. So it's a really fun series, but my problem with Paradox is, boy, are the DLCs expensive. I'm glad
let's not go into that discussion on the games as an art form episode.
Let's not talk about DLCs.
Yeah, but I want to say that I'm happy that Crusader Kings 2 is now free to play on Steam, and I recommend a lot of people go do that. So especially the fact that you don't have to have the DLCs. You can download the game for free, and you can download as many mods that you want that don't really require that many DLCs, or if any at all, and just still have a really fun experience, especially the Game of Thrones mod. So I'll get to that at the end. Really quickly, going to go through Total War and The Godfather, right? So, Total War, again, very fun game, very simple, basic, compared to Crusader Kings. Simple, similar concept. The whole point, though, with Total War games is actual conquest. You're supposed to dominate the whole map that you're playing on. Same with Crusader Kings 2, you're playing on a map, right? It's pretty much a board game that you're playing. Again, a lot of modding capabilities for those games, which makes it a lot of fun. Legacy of Kain was one of my favorite games when I was a young kid.
Before we move on from the strategy genre, can I add something?
Go for it.
So you brought up a genre that gets ignored way too often, and that is strategy.
Can confirm, I've never played a strategy game. I mean, I have, but
Can I please finish my thought? Thank you. So, back to the point Roger Ebert made where you aren't cultured if you waste too much time on games. If as a child I hadn't played Age of Empires 2 and the early Civ games and the early Total War games, I would never have cared about world history to even half of the degree I ended up caring to and looking into it myself and learning about it. My entire passion for history comes from strategy games that I played when I was young, where you had to manage empires and you had to play through these historical periods and experience, from different sides of history, like how the Total War games have gone from, Rome to Napoleon to Attila the Hun and so on to Shogun. Stuff like that is so ignored because they're not, the strategy genre isn't the most popular. It's not played by the most people, but it had such a building effect on my character and the way I have an interest in world history that I think it is a prime example of how video games can lead you to being more cultured just because of an inkling of that culture that exists in them.
I wholeheartedly agree. I was given Medieval Total War, the first game, when I was 8 by my neighbor who'd bought a PC the game had come with, and they didn't want to play the game. They weren't interested. But I was, because I was a kid and it was a free game. Why not? So I played it, and I didn't really think I would enjoy it at first. And back then I didn't really care for stuff like history and politics. But the Medieval Total War series, or Total War in general, and strategy games in general, did exactly that, just like you said. They made me interested in history and in geography and in geopolitics and politics in general, diplomacy, economics, or whatever you name it. And I agree, if it wasn't for those games, I probably wouldn't have cared one bit about any of those things.
I'm so happy you guys mentioned that, and I'm very happy that Joe mentioned Assassin's Creed 2, because as a historian, I absolutely credit Assassin's Creed with igniting my passion for the early modern period, the Renaissance, and pretty much the reason why I got my degree in history was because of Assassin's Creed. And this is a personal anecdote, but the very first time I went to an open day at my university before I obviously started the history degree, I sit down, professor comes along, he talks about it, and he goes, "If you're here because of Assassin's Creed, please leave." Honest to God story, I'm not making it up. If you're here to pursue stuff, and I was like, well, that's my cue to leave, but obviously I didn't leave. But again, I'm so glad you boys mentioned that. But yeah, Ebert's whole idea that you can't learn and you can't progress, or the hottest of takes, which I absolutely despise, when people say you're wasting your time by playing video games.
Oh my god, don't get me started.
That is the biggest pet peeve that I've experienced in probably my life. I am so appalled because I have learned so much from video games on a personal, on an intellectual, on a professional level, that statement as a whole just rubs me up in the most annoying ways.
Even can I use a very from my life example?
Of course, go ahead,
here?
Yeah.
I edit this podcast, and I also know how to edit video. Do you know how I got started learning these skills?
Well, from video games.
By editing video gameplay from games together, because I wanted to make funny YouTube videos. I learned to edit audio and video to a professional standard because of video games. So anytime someone tells me, don't waste your time, it's like, what have you learned in the past year, my friend?
We're getting a
any
bit
medium.
spiteful. Let's stop. We're getting a bit spiteful.
It's
but
funny you mentioned that, actually, because I want to direct all of our listeners, if you kindly please, to my new gaming channel on YouTube called Joe the Vintage Gamer, where I will play old games on my old PC, such as Crusader Kings 2, and maybe Skyrim, and maybe The Godfather, and talk about Game of Thrones a lot. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, you might not be at all, and I don't blame you. Please head over to YouTube to Joe the Vintage Gamer and
we'll link
replay.
that
we'll sure
in
link
the
that in the
description.
description.
Yeah, but before we go ahead, so quickly, why I think Godfather is a game of
Go
art.
on. Hot take of the episode. This is the cat's moment.
Hot take of the episode. Okay, so here's the thing. First of all, Legacy of Kain, great series. Go play it, because if you love Lovecraft, you're going to love Legacy of Kain. And it's really cheap on Steam. It's very cheap. It's so enjoyable. I've enjoyed every single game in the series. I've loved the narration. It's so everything, even though you can tell that, it's an old game, because of course it is. But it's so well done. Like, if I were to say, forget all the other games I played when I was a child, and there's one game I'm going to choose, or one series at least, that I would recommend to anyone to play, it's going to be the Legacy of Kain or the Blood Omen game, because they're so good. And I'm sure, I know that Lawrence can back me up on this.
Mm-hmm. I love that series. The Legacy of Kain games are just, I think they're one of the progenitors of like games giving you choice that actually mattered, because in them you, spoiler alert for like a 30-year-old game, play someone who ends up being the main villain of the series. And you don't really realize that at first, but as the game gives you certain options and you willingly sometimes make horrible choices, by the end, when the big reveal actually comes, you're like, yeah, no, that kind of makes sense. I guess I am a horrible monster.
Yeah, exactly. And imagine a game doing that to you when you're like, I don't know, 10 or 12, right?
Yeah.
So last honorable mention before I get to my hot take. Kingdom Come Deliverance is a game that I would love to play, but can't, because A, my PC doesn't have enough graphic card capability, and B, actually, there is no B. That's the only reason. So Kingdom Come Deliverance.
We're passing a basket for Joe's PC if anyone wants to donate.
Exactly, please do.
We'll be passing a basket.
Lawrence, that's right. So I've talked to Lawrence about this. Lawrence has played this game. He says, if ever a game was made for someone like me, because I love medieval history and medieval games in general, this is it. And I agree, because I've watched gameplays, walkthroughs, because I can't obviously afford to play the game myself. And not only is it spectacular, right, in my opinion, and not only is the art just on point for a game that took, I think, was it 8 years for the game developers to develop or something like that?
They're not like especially big devs or anything. They're
exactly.
Like almost indie, really. They're
right.
Some are, double A, somewhere between triple A and indie.
Right. And there's an argument to be made, like you were saying earlier about discoelysium, how indie games in general could have an advantage over AAA games in terms of being works of art, right? So Kingdom Come Deliverance, I think, one of the best games ever made for that genre in particular. Now, one day, if you go watch my YouTube channel and I get big, I'll play that game when I can afford it. Okay, now, my hot take before I hand back to you guys. The Godfather. So, The Godfather isn't like a multiple choice game. It's, in a way, it can be, depending on how you play it. And here's how I used to play it. So, for a long time, I used to play it the normal way. You start the game and you follow the quest line, right? But it's a somewhat, even though it's limited in certain circumstances, it's a somewhat open world. After the first 2 missions that you complete, you can pretty much go do whatever you want before you do the 3rd mission. So what I discovered I could do, which is not a grand discovery, was that I could go and take over pretty much all the families in New York before I do the 3rd mission. Which gives you an advantage, because by the time you do that, you have your stats pretty much all the way up. You've got a lot of money coming in. And there are certain missions where you have to drive by or do certain things where if you haven't taken over all the rackets and fronts and compound houses, that you're going to have a lot of trouble getting through those sticky situations. So I discovered that if I take over everything before I'm even on the 3rd mission, before I'm even, introduced to the main characters, that it could make it an easy playthrough. But it could also be fun if you don't do something like that. If you just go through the main story, it can still be a worthy experience, in my opinion. And it's a game that I used to play it a lot when I was younger, when I still had my PlayStation 2, and that's the last console I had, actually. If you don't count the consoles my brother has, but he mostly has Nintendo. So, and I occasionally go back to it. I think I rediscovered it on PC a few years ago, and I still have it, so I might play it again at some point. But it's definitely a game that I would say is a work of art, especially for its time, especially for what it tries to adapt, because I think The Godfather, the movie, is a work of art, and we'll get to movies at some point, I'm sure. So that's my hot take. Let me know what you think, guys, and I'll hand back to you if you want to mention any more honorable mentions before we move on, or anything else you want to talk about.
I mean, I have a suggestion for Ivaylo, and that's, we've talked a lot about AAAs, and we've played a lot of them, right? And I think, we all know that there's too many that we've enjoyed and we think are art to name in one episode.
Yes.
Exactly, like Persona 5 is incredible mishmash of visuals, music, etc. We'll talk about a lot of these games later. We both, I think, really think Ghost of Tsushima is a masterpiece in the way it like captures atmosphere and the island of Tsushima, etc. I think one thing we need to give some attention to before we go off, is indie games as a, section of video games.
They have to be covered. They really have to be covered.
Yeah. I think I'll let you start with, what are the indie games that have, to you, had the greatest artistic impact?
One of the smaller ones, but also, one of the major ones that I can name off the top of my head is Journey. I think that Journey is a beautifully developed game. It is so simple, yet so beautiful, and so harrowing in a way, because it is what it is. It's really not a false advertising game. Journey takes you on a amazing journey throughout incredible landscapes. You are experiencing a lot of different emotions and a lot of different ideas. You meet other people, you meet different individuals. And in my personal opinion, Journey can be up there with any single game that we've mentioned so far, As far as indie games go, I'm also familiar with Celeste. I think Celeste is a great indie game, is it not? Celeste, Cuphead, stuff like that, all those good kind of
I mean, you mentioned Journey specifically. I feel like Journey is the kind of game that is so art that you can sit someone down who's never played a video game.
Experience it, yes.
Yeah, and they will by the end be like, holy crap, that had an effect. I've done that to a few people I know. I've gotten them to sit down. I've been like, this game will not require massive mechanical skill from you. I want you to play through it. I'm not going to help you. I'm not even going to be in the same room. Just play through it and see how it makes you feel.
Enjoy yourself. All that stuff. I did want to ask you about one of your favorite games, which you kept bugging me to get, which was Hollow Knight. Can you tell us more about Hollow Knight?
Oh, my goodness. I mean, we're at indies. I'm going to tell you about a lot of stuff, because I've played hundreds upon hundreds of indie games looking for, the gems. Currently, first off, I want to mention anything by Supermassive Games is a piece of art. Now, this indie company... they have some of the best, from what I hear, treatment of employees ever. They refuse to allow crunch. They're an incredible bunch of people. But their latest game is called Hades. And it is one of the most amazing experiences I've gotten from a game developed by such a small studio compared to a AAA developer. And all their other games too, Pyre, Transistor, all of them, they're so incredible. They make these games that are just... They refuse to make sequels to begin with, right? So every single game they put out is this fresh, completely new conceptually experience, and almost all of them follow different forms of gameplay. They've done turn-based RPGs. They've done almost graphic novel sports games. They've done Hades, which is a roguelike where you have almost an insane amount of narrative and dialogue written.
Wasn't it? Hades, yeah.
Yes, it was, which, for an indie game, that tells you a lot about just the level of quality this small team managed to put into this. And one thing I'll say about it, Hades specifically, I've put in 200 hours. There are still runs I will do of Hades where someone will give you dialogue I have not seen yet. I don't know how much dialogue they've written and recorded voice acting for, but there are times where it blows my mind that there's still stuff I haven't heard when I get to it. You mentioned Hollow Knight. There's so many Castlevania, Metroidvania style games. That's what they get called a lot these days. Where, you have that old 2D platformer style, but the level of just art and the way they're crafted with the care and the mechanics being almost perfect now in some of them, built upon years, decades of previous ones. Stuff like Hollow Knight is it's an incredible game. And again, it's an indie. You can get it for on sales like £7.
Incredibly cheap, yeah.
You can experience some of these more like indie titles, these indie games that are art, like Cuphead, which is
Amazing.
I believe the entire
Absolutely
game
amazing
is
game.
hand drawn.
Yes. Yes.
Anyone who's seen it and seen the way it recreates the old Disney art style when it was all hand drawn and when it is incredible even see it in motion.
It's truly a lost art in the age of digital computing that people still practice 2D animation and hand-drawn stuff. So, absolutely incredible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's too many indies today that are incredible. That's the thing. You know, you've got like stuff from Edmund Macmillan, which is like the Super Meat Boy games, Binding of Isaac, where he has this very distinct art style, and all his games tackle these weird, almost gross, terrifying concepts, but in a very cartoony style. So like Binding of Isaac is almost, it's a roguelike, so you just spawn and do different runs as Isaac and you try not to die, but it tackles like concepts of biblical religion and extremist belief in it, that it's crazy to see that like mix of that art style and that kind of game. There's a game called Papers, Please, if any of you have ever heard or played of it, where you play a border guard who has to decide which people can go past into the country or out. And it's really simple. You're at a desk, you're given different forms of ID, and you decide who can enter this almost semi-neo-fascist communist country that you're part of. And you're having to juggle this thing where you feel bad for some of these people that you have to turn away, right, from the border. But you also have to feed your family in the game. That's part of the mechanic. You have to have enough money that your family doesn't starve to death. So you're trying to follow the government mandate of turning away people based on really small, trivial bullshit. And you have to make that choice knowing I have to get paid right now, because if I don't, the game's over because my family's going to starve to death. And it's things that, like, I feel indie games have this ability to do things, like I mentioned earlier in the podcast, that AAAs don't for a number of reasons. AAA games are like, a lot of them these days are made by committee. A lot of Ubisoft games, you see like the beautiful worlds they have, but a lot of the bad, annoying choices in these games are made by committees who are trying to get you to pay as much money as possible.
EA Sports.
Who are trying to like... Yeah, who are trying to increase your like hours of engagement because that's how they sell to investors to get even more money. And indie games, a lot of times, are somewhat free from some of these shackles. So you get games that can, like Papers, Please, that I mentioned, go into concepts that you almost didn't think would be possible as a video game. You know what I mean? You didn't expect anyone would ever do that, because how could that possibly work or be successful or be engaging? And yet, the moment someone does it and there's not, the restrictions of people above them telling them what they can or can do, you get these crazy little concept projects that are just mind-blowing. A genre that is currently having a weird rise because of the comeback of games like Doom are what are currently being called boomer shooters. Now, boomer shooters are the old shooters that were like, you couldn't aim down sights, they were incredibly fast, and they all had like that specific 2D art style. And there is one specifically developed by an indie dev called Dusk that I think puts to shame 90% of first-person shooters I've played. In just the level of content and secrets and engagement with you, the way it feels to play it. You see such amazing art from these studios that aren't shackled by monetary responsibilities to, like, investors, that I think indie games offer an entire layer to this argument of like games as art that you just can't achieve with AAA constraints.
And they're only just beginning.
And when you do,
they're only just beginning.
Exactly. And when you do manage to do it with AAA constraints, it has to be, like we mentioned, Bioshock, Shadow of the Colossus, it has to be incredible, or else that studio may as well shut down after if it's a failure. But with indies, they have these dedicated tiny fan bases, so you get lots of really interesting, really compelling little concepts being given life in a world and environment economically where otherwise they wouldn't even have a chance to have existed. And that's what I think indie games offer to like the art form in general. They're an avenue that people can use for passion projects, for real passion projects. Because I can guarantee No one looked at Papers, Please, where you are doing paperwork at a border for a dystopian communist nightmare country, and went, this is an idea that's going to sell billions.
No one did that.
It would not have passed pre-planning in like a big development, place.
And I did want to we're getting a bit late overdue, so I did want to close off this episode with a question which I've wanted to ask you boys, since this happens to me, not often, but it has happened to me. Video games have power. We've admitted that, and it's safe to say all the video games we've covered so far, we have the recommend of them being pieces of art. We can give them the 2 thumbs up, right? So,
oh yeah, absolutely.
I do want to ask one final question before we wrap it up, and this is also for everyone listening. You can tell us in the comments and just in general. Video games that have made you cry. I want to know if there are any video games or so that have just made you, shed a manly tear. You just felt the light coming out of the side of your eye. Just a little bit of a tear. I've already talked about the majority which have made me, which was Shadow, Bioshock, the Telltale game that The Walking Dead made me bawl like a little baby. I was so upset. Another game which made me cry, which I didn't talk about, and I want maybe Lawrence will talk about when I hand him over. Red Dead Redemption, the first one. Incredibly emotional game, teared up as well. Life is Strange as well, made me very upset, even though the dialogue in that game is a bit horrible, but again, game is powerful. So yeah, any video games that made you guys, just maybe, it's okay if you don't have any, but if you just maybe you were sitting there, you completed and you're like, man, I'm upset.
I mean, there is one I've mentioned on here that did make me cry. I mean, no, actually, there's 2 that did make me cry. First should be obvious, Disco Elysium. It's one of my favorite games of all time. But there are moments in that game where certain concepts of existential philosophy and depression they're gone through and expanded in such a way that by the end of those sections, I was almost in tears. Yes. Just because of how spot on the head some of these things were gone. I felt like I was playing something made by people that completely understood how I feel and have felt before at certain points in my life. It felt like I was, experiencing a piece of art where I could see the connecting tissue between what I look for in this medium and what these developers were giving me in these moments, and these deeply emotional moments in the game. And it managed to make me
beautiful
cry.
Stuff.
It really did.
Beautiful stuff. Second one?
Another thing is, so Dark Souls, there's a very good YouTuber for Dark Souls. Like I told you, the world is very fractured in the game. You have to do a lot of work to piece it together. There's a YouTuber called VaatiVidya, and he's for almost 2 decades, I think.
Shout out!
Maybe. Since Dark Souls 1, he's been making videos called Prepare to Cry, where he actually... He takes together all the lore that's been found about the characters and people and things that you run into in that world, in the Dark Souls series and the Bloodborne series and all of them, and he pieces together the narrative more cohesively. And some of them are so sad in such a specific way that I have always found gets to me, that when I replayed those games after watching some of Vaati's videos way in the past, I felt like I was going to cry for certain outcomes, for certain characters, for certain even enemies you face, because it was so sad conceptually what you were dealing with.
Yeah, I agree.
There is spoiler for Dark Souls 1. I don't care. It's old. You can get over yourselves. Play the damn game. You fight this massive dog as one of the bosses called Sif, right?
I'm going to take my headphones off because I actually want to play the game.
Okay, you do that. Come back in a minute and a half. So you fight Sif, the doggo, and you kill him, because you have to get a certain item. Now, if you play the DLC, you find out that this dog, Sif, was defending this item you were trying to get because his own master had gone down this path and died, and you face him and kill his master too later. And the dog was literally doing everything to stop you from making the same mistake. So you kill this enemy that is incredibly scary and vicious in size and ferocity when you fight him. But then afterwards, you get this incredibly sad punch to the gut if you were playing it back then, for the first time, where it's... wow, I feel like such a shit human being for having killed this thing that literally remembered me due to a time paradox in the game and was trying to save me from a certain terrible outcome. And I was just like, oh, wow, this makes... Every time I've had to fight this boss ever since, I just feel bad. Because now I know this information, and it just makes me sad, you know?
I'm so happy I didn't hear any of
Every
that.
single
I'm
time.
so happy.
Yeah, okay, so we moved on. And now, other stuff that's made us cry. I mean, one that I say, you also mentioned, and I think both of us had, the end of Walking Dead Season 1, which is the only Walking Dead game I like from Telltale.
It's
but
the only good one.
the end of Season 1
so emotional.
actually got me.
As well.
I cried, and I was like a baby, and I was like, I cannot believe this game did this to me.
You don't expect it, do you? You really don't expect it.
Yeah, how could you hurt me in such a way at this moment after I've already done all this crap? Everyone's like died, and I get to that point and it's just like, wow, you just hit me with the shittiest emotional softball. And I was just like, God, this has broken me. I didn't play anything for like a few days because I was just like, this is so depressing.
I think it was a snowballing effect because it kept building up and up and up and up and up, and all this tragedy kept happening, and then it just like culminated and all that, you know?
Oh yeah, no, the first Walking Dead may as well be like called the tragedy to video game by the end.
and
and I think one more that I can think of that made me sad. I mean, Joe, you give us some that maybe have gone to you. I'll think about that for a second.
The problem with me is that I probably haven't played enough games to have felt sad, or enough games like you guys have to felt sad. Obviously, Dark Souls definitely made me sad, especially Sif. But I wanted to mention, I can't remember her name. I think it was Jane Kidd or James Kidd. Assassin's Creed Black Flag?
Yes.
Yes.
When she dies, that did make me cry. And
I will say, the scene at the end where you see all the people that have died, the characters you met that have died at the table at the end of the game, that almost got to me. I felt like a tinge of like my heart being like wrenched. Because you're sitting there, the song starts playing, I think Anne Bonny's singing it, or someone is, and you see all these characters that, I loved a lot of them. They were great characters. That game's one of the better Assassin's Creed games. Oh, yeah. And you see them all around this table looking at you and going like, go live your life, bye. We've all died in terrible, tragic ways.
We're here spoiling all the video games, bro. We're spoiling everything.
Oh, get over it. It's
like from 2014, isn't it? It's pretty old.
Yeah. But yeah, no, that's one moment that, I think in the whole Assassin's Creed series, that's that one, and when Ezio finds Altair.
Yes, that got me.
No, not Ezio's family. Oh, no. When Ezio finds Altair.
Oh, yes, that's right. Yeah.
This old
in the crypt.
Skeleton.
Really? That made you cry?
I don't know why. No, it didn't make me cry, but that was one of the few moments in the series where I felt like actually emotional.
Fair enough.
Because Assassin's Creed 1 was one of the first games I had on the 360, so I've replayed it lots, because I had it, Halo 3, and like a racing game. So I replayed 1 a lot. So I actually really liked Altair as a character, and Revelations does a really good job building him up to not be a piece of shit, which he was in the first game. Exactly. So by the end, when you see that this old dude just sitting there willing to die in this library just to wait for whoever comes after it to find this object, this key, it's like, wow, that actually got to me. And I didn't expect that, because Assassin's Creed games usually, they don't really get me emotional. The gameplay itself isn't very cohesive with the emotional narrative parts that they usually try to push, if that makes sense. I think the last one that did make me like actually cry, not Mass Effect 2 and 3. Those games, you have a party that is one of the best developed like RPG parties ever. Like, you have characters that you get to know to the point where you can debate their philosophy for them. You can be like, I understand what this character believes and what they've done in life. And certain characters in that series, I'm not going to mention which, but anyone who knows, die at certain points. And their deaths are so hard-hitting because of how attached you've become to them as these like friends in your team that you've gotten to know and had to build relationships with to even have them survive certain points in the games or stick by you when you make certain choices. There were moments in Mass Effect that made me cry. Like, just character deaths that were so sad because they were my favorite characters. And it was like, well, I guess the rest of the game is going to be way more depressing now that it's just me and the 3 guys on my team that I hate. Yay.
That's beautiful, and I absolutely thank you for sharing those emotions. And yeah, I mean, anyone else have anything to say? I pretty much covered everything I have to say.
Last thing to say is, you know how when you play certain games, you can choose what your character looks like, what gender they are, and all that kind of stuff. I think what's great about games is that you can be whoever you want to be.
Yes,
you know?
indeed.
It's something that you can't really do with books or movies or anything else, really. So that's another aspect of it. That not just games that are considered works of art, but games in general, especially those that I've just mentioned. The ability that it gives you to be just whoever you want to be, the escapism that it provides, which I'm sure a lot of us are indulging in right now. We're recording this ahead of time, but I'm assuming we're still in some form of lockdown or tier by the time you're listening to this.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, you know.
Yeah, man. I absolutely agree. But yeah, anyone else have anything else to say about it?
I mean, I think we've said most of what we. I mean, again, I think it would take like 100 hours to talk about each game one by one. That
we are more than happy if there
enjoyed.
is interest from the audience to do.
Well, yeah, if people like this episode, and we get a lot of. If you press that like button,
here we go.
Smash that like button. And that will tell us to not only will it help the YouTube algorithm or any other algorithm on any other platform, but it will let us know that you enjoyed this episode, and it will be more likely for us to do a part 2.
Yes, and should you want us to break down individually any of these games, dedicate a whole episode to them, we're more than happy to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, please remember to share these so that other people can become cultured and
That's right.
stick it to Roger Ebert.
We can
and
always
his
just
stupid
hate
bullshit.
on Roger Ebert. This is what we do on Faffing with Friends. We hate on an old man who
I
is
like
dead
that.
now. But yes, this has been
May you rest in peace.
indeed right. This is
And just before we go, so as always, I'm going to probably mention this for some time until everybody's done this. So please go to our socials. Go to Twitter @FaffingFriends. We'll have a link where we'll share all our other links and social medias on there. Please subscribe to us, like and share, and also comment. That's very important. We want to hear what you guys think, and just talk to us. Keep the conversation going below in the comment bar or anywhere else, on Twitter or anywhere else, on Facebook even. What you think about the games we've discussed, anything you think we've missed out. And if you want us to, like Ivaylo and Lauren said, if you want us to talk about anything else, just mention it, and we might do so in the future.
beautiful.
Also, there's 3 of us, so if you say something, it's more than likely one of us will see it. So try not to be
At any
assholes.
point in the day, with someone else will see it.
Yeah.
But yes. So, shall we sign off?
Let's go.
You do it, yo.
Oh, I do it. I'm so sorry.
Thing, go on.
So this has been Joe.
This has been Ivaylo.
And this is the greatest one here, Lawrence.
Goodbye.
Good.
Goodbye.